Student diversity. The organizing questions for this chapter are the impact of culture on teaching and learning, and we're going to also look at how socioeconomic status affects student achievement. How do ethnicity and race affect student school experiences? And how do language definitions and bilingual programs affect student achievement? We're also going to look at what is multicultural education, and then we're also going to look at gender and gender bias and how that affects students' school experiences. And then how do students differ in intellectual and learning styles? So this chapter is pretty much all about the diversity of students as a whole. So what is the impact of culture on teaching and learning? Obviously, students differ. They differ in ethnicity, culture, social class, and home language. If you've ever traveled to a foreign country, you notice differences in behavioral, attitude, dress, language, and food. Culture is shared norms, traditions, behaviors, language, and perceptions of a group. So when we're talking about culture, you're not necessarily talking about ethnicity because they're two different things. And we're going to get into that in just a bit. But when you're talking about a culture, you could just have a culture among your friends, your shared norms, your traditions, your behavior, your language. It's actually how your whole group perceives things. The life of a middle-class family in the United States or Canada can be more like the life of a middle-class family in Ireland, Italy, or Israel than a lower-class family living about a mile away. So otherwise, your SES or your social status, it would be the same across cultures as it would be by just going down the street to somebody who is at a different socioeconomic status as you are. So SES is probably the biggest predictor. If you look at the figure on 4.1 in your book, you can see that there you have the individual overlapping all of these different things. Social class is the one that we talked about just a second ago. It's probably the highest predictor. Race is also in there. Ethnic group, whether you're disabled or non-disabled. Your religion plays a large role in many cultures based on that. And a lot of times religion has to do with culture as well. Your region, what part of the country or what part of the world you come from, and then also your gender or your gender identity. So SES affects student achievement. Sociologists define social class or socioeconomic status in terms of individuals' income, their occupation, their education, and their prestige in society. So how much you make depends on really what they're talking about, because the only two things we can measure really well is how much you make and then also your level of education. We tend to look at the children's parents' levels of education, particularly their mother's level of education, because that tends to predict how well students will do in school. And then we also look at income. Because these factors seem to go together, socioeconomic status is usually income and then education. Table 4.1 shows a relationship between typical social class groupings in the United States and then family income. So if your family makes over $186,000 or more, you're in the top 5% of the wealth bracket. So you're wealthier than 95% of the population. And you might not think that's that much because a lot of people go, 186,000, you're thinking millions. But actually, if your family makes over $186,000 a year, you're in the top 5% of the families in wealth. The upper class is if they make over 100,000. 100,000 to probably 199,000 is considered to be the lower upper class. And then the upper class is 200,000 or more. So if you're at 186,000 or more, you make up 5% of the population. The upper middle class, and you always hear people talk about the middle class, is actually ranges from $63,000 to $100,000. And then the lower middle class is $40,000 to $63,000. What we consider the lower tier or the working class is the $20,000 to $40,000. And this typically means that it's a family of four, the wealth of a family of four. And then the lower class is $20,000 or less. Now you have to say, what does socioeconomic status really have to do with how well kids do in school? Well, it really has to go back to child rearing practices and then also the opportunities that are afforded to children at the higher levels of income. So roles of child rearing practices. A lot of research has been done on this because the average difference between middle class and lower class parents and child rearing practices are the main reasons for differences in school achievement. As we talked about in the last chapter, children come in with a much richer vocabulary when they're in the middle class or upper middle class. there are actually like 20,000 words difference between a child coming in from a lower class than a middle class to upper class. Many children from low-income families receive an upbringing that is less consistent with the expected school behavior than do middle-class families. They don't have the same structure as a middle-class family, and they don't have the same behavioral expectations, according to the research. An important difference between middle-class and lower-class families are the kind of activities that parents do with them. A middle-class family is more likely to take their children on vacations. They are more likely to take their children to museums, more educationally based. If they go to camps in the summer, in a summer camp, it'll be a summer camp, maybe a science summer camp or a math summer camp, or it could be space camp or something like that. Where lower income families tend to go to like the YMCA or some kind of local club or something like that, and the activities are less structured and less academically focused. So when we look at this, we're talking about some of the school and community factors. So children from low-income families are often placed at risk for school failure by the characteristics just of the communities that they live in. They tend to have a higher rate of crime, and the role models in those communities are not as high. A lot of the kids that I work with at some of the lower-income schools that I work with, they were, a lot of their uncles and brothers and such like that had already been in prison or were in prison. And there was a lot more drug dealing going on in those areas, so they saw that was a income factor, was that they would see the only way out of poverty was through dealing drugs. Actually, the kids that I interviewed for my dissertation, there was 3 ways out of poverty. One was to be good in sports, and then you were going to go make it big in sports. The second one was to be good at entertainment, like if you could sing or you had some other kind of entertainment ability. They thought that would be a way to get out of the community. And then the third one was through dealing drugs. School was not seen as an avenue for success, for future success. That's changed some with the better role models that we have now in society. When I was teaching, the only really successful African American I could talk about at the time was like Colin Powell, which he went into the military, which a lot of the kids didn't really think that was a good idea. And then there was Clarence Thomas, who was appointed to the Supreme Court in the 80s, but there was such a controversy that came with him, it wasn't readily known. So we look at the characteristics of the community that they live in, and there's not a lot of role models. Now, in today's day and age, we've had a president that's been African American. We have a Hispanic woman who sits on the Supreme Court. We've had many judges. Condoleezza Rice is an African American woman who was Secretary of State. So there's much more upwardly mobile persons of color that have made it big, and it's been through the avenue of education. So I'm hoping that some of that will shift. The schools they attend tend to be in the lower socioeconomic areas. I think about my friend Dina, who lives in San Francisco, and she lives in a wealthy, anywhere in San Francisco is wealthy, but she lives in Kent, which is just right over the bridge in San Francisco. And in order to go put her kids in this local public school, each family had to donate $1,000 per child to the elementary school. And if you didn't do it, your name was... they actually posted the names of the people who donated in the paper. So you were pretty much, like shamed if you didn't do that. So it was pretty much expected. So you can imagine if each parent of each child gave an extra $1,000, how many cool after-school programs they had, how many computers they had, everything that they had. Where schools in these lower socioeconomic areas, they're more run down. They tend not, because the parents don't speak up and don't go to PTA meetings and SAC meetings, stuff like that. They don't tend to get the attention that are afforded to schools that are in higher socioeconomic areas. So school funding in most areas in the United States is correlated with social class. Middle-class children are likely to attend school with greater resources, better paid teachers, and other advantages. So if you're a new teacher, they're going to put you probably at the lower socioeconomic school, because not all the teachers want to stay there because they don't have the resources that the other teachers have. So therefore, these kids are getting more inexperienced teachers and not necessarily the cream of the crop. But regardless of what happens in some of the schools, we have children that are called resilient children. They make it out of there and they make something of themselves regardless of that. And then there's also complete schools that are just resilient schools. So low socioeconomic status does not automatically doom children to failure. Many children placed at risk develop what is called resiliency or resilience. And that's the ability to succeed despite the many risk factors. Schools that are provide resilient children, or that are really supportive of resilient children, have a supportive school community. I think about Ron Clark Academy, and if you haven't seen it, look it up. Or if you haven't seen the Ron Clark movie, I strongly suggest you watch it. It's a great movie. He built this school in a really, really depressed area of Atlanta with really high socioeconomic income kids. But it's kind of like a lottery. It is a charter school, so it's like a lottery that you have to get into it. But kids that are on the low end of the scale, like whose parents don't make any money, it's a sliding scale. So if you want your kid to go there and you make a lot of money, you have to actually pay more. But it's really, really supportive, and they've got community backers, and they have all kinds of stuff, and it's a safe and orderly environment. And so what we found with schools that produce resilient children, they're safe and orderly, there's positive student-teacher relationships, and there's a focus. There's like, this is what we do, this is who we are, this is where we go, this is what we believe. And that brings us to that whole idea of family, community, school partnerships. Professional educators who reach out to families and other community members tend to have higher success rates. So there's different types of ways that schools will do this. Some schools have done things like parenting. They've had parenting classes where they actually assist families with parenting skills. There's one over in Daytona Beach, the Child's Academy. And one of the things that they do is they actually take teen mothers, because they find that if people have children young, they tend to not have they're still kids themselves, so they tend to have not the greatest parenting skills. So we partnered with them at one time, and it's continued that you give books to the moms before they're pregnant and teach them to read to their child in utero, and then how to read to them when they're just babies. And the parents, the kids that have went through that program, the kids scored higher scores in their reading because their parents have been reading to them. They have this unbelievable library with checkout books, but the biggest part of the program is just teaching them parenting skills, behavior parenting skills, like how to create a behavior management program at home and how to get your kids to behave at home, things about nutrition and feeding and making sure you have proper nutrition. They have a nurse and a nurse practitioner that is right there on campus, so that the parents can bring their children in. They have wraparound health care. And then they also have the babies right there, that the babies can stay there while the moms finish high school. And then they also try to help them segue to in vocational programs or colleges. Communicating, inform families about schools' programs and the student progress, keeping that open communication with parents, letting them volunteer, inviting parents to volunteer in the school. And then some of the other ones have programs that are called Learning at Home, where they involve families in homework or goal setting or curriculum-linked activities. One of the schools I worked with before, Stark, had this whole idea of a curriculum-linked activity where they would, the kids who came to an after-school program called the STARS program also were part of the Food Brings Hope. So when the kids stayed after and the kids were actively involved in the extracurricular activities that were all academically linked, the parents got free groceries at the end. There's another study that was done in Texas that on second graders that actually paid grocery coupon dollars to parents whose children read books and passed the reading counts points. So if your kid passed a reading counts point, you got $2 for your groceries. And there were parents who's got like $50 and $60 worth of groceries every month, just based on their children reading. Those children who did that actually scored well above proficiency on their reading test at the end of the year. Other ones do decision making. Most districts have went to something called a SAC, which is a school advisory committee, and it includes families in the decisions that are made in the school and getting them involved in making it their school. And that goes along with collaborating within the community. Clark is excellent at this, coordinating businesses, agencies, cultural and civic groups. He has something called the Great Shake, because he said that even though he prepared the kids academically, they didn't have the self-esteem to be able to do these interviews for some of these more prestigious schools that he wanted to send them to. So he started teaching them how to present themselves and how to interview, really. And so he does something called the Great Shake, where the kids have to walk around and shake hands and look people in the eye and then tell them who they are. Like, hi, I'm Kathy Piechura. How are you? What brings you here to the Ron Kark Academy? And that's how they would do this whole interaction between the adult and the child. So they do this collaborating with community, and they do this Great Shake. And when they do the Great Shake, they invite the community members to grade the kids' shake and how they introduce themselves. And then they pick, like, I think out of the first 60 kids or so, then they pick, like, on the next, I think it's 15. And then those 15 go into the second round, and then there's corporations and people that come into the second round, and they grade them on the second round. And it goes down all the way to that there's like a final 2 or 3, I think it is. And companies actually pay Ron to be part of the Great Shake. So like a couple years ago, the head of Coca-Cola was the one that did the final decision and brought the kids to the Coca-Cola's headquarters, and they had to present some information to the board of directors and stuff like that. And then they joked that they voted on it. But Ron got all these community businesses to actually donate money to the school to be part of this Great Shake, because then what he does is he has it in the paper and everything, and everybody has good PR from it. And one of the things that he told us, which I thought was really interesting when I went there last year, was he said, companies want to be involved in education, they just don't know how. And they want other people to know that they're involved. So supporting achievement for children in low income, schools can do a great deal to do that. And there's a lot of intense interventions designed to help develop kids' cognitive skills early in life. We have to work on kids. Most of the kids that are in low income don't know their ABCs or to be able to count to 10 in their before they come to school. And many of them don't know their colors and such. That's why Volusia does the VPK, the virtual voluntary preschool, because we want to get these kids a little bit earlier. And middle-class families tend to do a better job of preparing their kids for school and interacting with them and getting, like, reading to them every night. Having family dinners is a huge thing, too. Sitting down at a dinner table and having conversations. There's a really good study that's by Pogro that talks about that when you sit at a dinner table and you start discussing your day or talking about events that are going on in the day, that it causes kids to start to elaborate and think on their thinking and be able to articulate them better. And it found that most of the kids that he worked with that were in low income did not have that. They didn't sit around and talk about their day or discuss movies or things that they had seen. So they were missing that Socratic method of discussion. So he introduces that in 3rd grade. And he found that once he started to teach kids how to articulate and think, that their scores and their grades went better. So that research suggests that building those positive relationships with parents and parents giving them practical means of helping their children succeed is the most important. Because what we tend to do is blame the family instead of helping the family figure out what they can do. Matter of fact, one of the teachers that worked just recently was made the news. It was, or Facebook or something like that, because she no longer gave homework if the parents had dinner with their children and sat at dinner, because she would rather them sit at dinner than doing homework together. So when we look at theory into practice, that would be some of the ways that parents can get involved. You want to do home visits. You want to go visit your children. I found unbelievable amounts of information by just even driving through the neighborhoods of some of the kids that I met. One in particular that I went on a home visit, this little boy was kind of a bully in my class, and I was always on him because he was bullying other kids. But when I watched him walk into his classroom, I realized why he was a bully, because that was the only behavior that was modeled for him. He walked in and he became a victim instead of a bully. His dad just immediately started yelling at him, immediately went and started doing some chores, and he looked very scared. And come to find out that his dad was pretty abusive when he didn't do things. So when he came to school, instead of getting bullied, he wanted to be the bully, because it gave him some power to be able to not have to worry about getting struck at. So after I started treating him differently, like he was a victim, and teaching all of the kids about the effects of bullying and how to stand up to a bully and what you can do to save yourself from a bully, his entire attitude turned around. Frequent newsletters to families, just letting them know what's going on, inviting them back into the home. Family workshops. A lot of families don't know what to do with their kids in the summer, like what kind of activities you can do, what's available during that time. Positive phone calls home. I always like to say this, that a lot of these families, the only phone calls they get are the phone calls that are not positive. They're negative phone calls home, so giving positive phone calls home is always a good idea. I did it one time. We used to write letters to my students every week, talking about, not every week to every kid, but I would pick a kid and I saw him doing something good and I'd write a note home, and the kid came up to me and he goes, "Hey, Miss P, that's a really nice letter you wrote my parents." I said, "Well, that's great. Did they like it?" And he goes, "Well, could you resend it? Because I've never gotten a good letter before, and I kind of opened it before they got home and I'd like them to open it." And I said, "Oh, bummer. I guess you're going to have to be good again so I can write another one, because nope, I don't repeat them." So I did. I caught him being good a couple weeks later and sent another one home. But that's kind of sad to know that the only interaction that his parents ever had, or that he ever had, was negative ones. And a lot of these parents also don't remember school positively themselves, because they may not have been the most, academically talented when they were a kid. So they don't think of school in a positive way. So that's why you want to invite them as a volunteer, and make them your partner. Let them know that you're there for their child and that you're there for the best of them. That all you care about is making sure that their child succeeds. Another aspect that happens with children who are disadvantaged is that we have this idea called the opportunity gap, that we don't close that opportunity gap. Children that come from middle or upper class families tend to have their vision checked more often. So children who come from lower socioeconomic status have severe visual impairment at twice the normal rate as children who do not come from a lower socioeconomic, or that are at the above socioeconomic family. They have more hearing problems. They tend to have more hearing problems. They are far more likely to live in homes where lead dust is in the air, and lead exposure can lead to mental retardation, and it definitely impedes their academic ability. Another aspect of it is asthma. Children that come from lower socioeconomic status tend to have asthma at 6 times the national rate as those that are from the upper echelon. And so asthma causes chronic illness, and they miss a lot more school. So they're 6 times more likely to have asthma. With medical care, they're less likely to receive medical care because they can't afford it. So adequate medical care leads to problems with absenteeism, poor motivation because of poor health. And then that vision, hearing, asthma, it's all mentioned earlier. That was one of the nice things that I liked about the Affordable Care Act, is that it actually increased in many states the level of Medicaid, so that people of lower income were eligible for Medicaid. Even though it's harder to find physicians when you're on Medicaid, at least you had some kind of insurance that went along with it. And then we have to look at nutrition too, because the foods that tend to be cheap or less expensive are not fresh foods of high quality of vitamins and minerals. They rely on a lot of fast food or processed foods, and so those unhealthy diets actually cause children not to do as well, and that we don't really have anybody with malnutrition. It's rare in the United States. But it still does affect. There's one study that was done like in '96 by Nesser, and simply giving kids vitamins and mineral supplements improved their test scores. So there's some implications on socioeconomic diversity for teachers. For one thing, I want to warn us, do not just automatically go in, because a lot of teachers will use kids' SES as an excuse for why their kids are not performing. So kids enter school with varying degrees of preparation and behaviors that lead to success. But that doesn't mean that we can't change that or turn it around. kids' conducts and attitudes and values vary, but you as a teacher can help shape those. Lack of preparation does not mean they're destined for academic failure. So if they come in kindergarten and they're just not where you think they should be, that doesn't mean that they're destined for it. It just means you got to work a little harder. I always think about a teacher that I work with at Woodward, and every beginning of every year she would go, "Oh my gosh, they're such a mess. I'm never going to be. I've got such a a wide variety of kids, and some of them don't even know their letters, and some of them are already reading." And she would always go on and on. And by the end of the year, she always had them at the highest level of reading. When we used to dibble kids, it was a measure we used to use. They were always at blue sky, which is the highest they could be, blue sky heaven. And I always think, here was a teacher that took them where they were at and brought them up where she wanted them to be. So although you need to be aware of the struggles that they encountered by many kids who are disadvantaged, you also need to avoid falling into that stereotype. So many times I'll hear teachers say, well, you know where they come from. Well, yeah, I do. But you know what? Your job is to take them where they're at and bring them up to where you want them to be. So low expectations can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's why if you talk about it at the Ron Clark Academy, it's one of the things I loved about him. He takes them at 5th grade. That's when the school opens up. And in 5th grade, he'll say, all the 5th grades will tell you that they cry. He says, if you don't cry, you're not working hard enough. Because he talks to him about being a marathon runner. If you ever know anyone that runs a marathon, they'll say like that last, when they hit the wall, they usually hit the wall around mile 23. I am not a runner, so I can't speak from this personally, but I've seen my husband do it. And around mile 23, he hits the wall. And I mean, when he comes across that finish line at mile 26, I mean, if he's not crying, he looks like he should be crying. He looks like he's almost dead. And I've watched other people just tears streaming down their face. And so what Ron says is that if you don't struggle with something, it's not worth doing it. So if you don't cry, then you're not challenging yourself enough. So all of the kids in his 5th grade class will go, oh yeah, I cried. Oh yeah, I cried. Because he feels as though, you got to reach for it, you got to struggle. So he sets the bars really high. He actually teaches like calculus and trigonometry to like 6th and 7th graders, because he wants that some of them, he said, need to be at that high of level because they need to be pushed that hard. So he sets really high expectations, and the kids reach up and get there. But I will also say, a parent will come in. He said the parent came in and was complaining because his kid was crying. And he said to the parent, I haven't seen him at the lunchtime study halls, and I haven't seen him after school. And we have tutors for those specific skills every day after school. And this is a hard school. You're right. This is. We set expectations really high, and we want you to reach that. But we have support for you to reach that. And I guess that's the real difference, is you can't just expect kids to do it. You have to provide that scaffold or that support. Remember going back to chapter 2, on Vygotsky, you have to scaffold that learning and give them the support and the ladder that they need to get up to that level. So then how does ethnicity and race affect students' school experience? One major detriment of a child's cultural background is his or her ethnic origin. So ethnic group is a shared identity with a common culture. So you can have, and a race is your physical characteristic. So you can be of the same race, but you aren't necessarily of the same ethnic group. So let's say, for instance, you can be African American, but have lived here for 3 generations. And then you can also be African American and have just moved from Kenya or from South Africa. And so even within Kenya and South Africa, they would have completely different ethnic groupings. So depending on your shared common culture, it makes up your ethnic group. And your race is just those physical characteristics. Most people would say that your ethnic group or your culture is it's a construct, whereas your race, your physical characteristics are something that it's just attributed to you. Most of the children that have difficulty in school come from the underrepresented groups, and they're the groups that are found less often in situations of economic security and power. So they don't have the power that comes with wealth and the security that comes with wealth. So they can't just go out and get their kid a tutor, or they can't just go out and take their kid to a museum, because they don't have that kind of economic security. So when we look at this, and we look at the table on 4.3, we look at that right now in 2010, Eastern European Americans, or European Americans, not Eastern, but European Americans made up 79.5% of the population. Hispanics was 16%, and African Americans was 12.9%, almost 13%. Asian Pacific Islanders were 5% and American Indians were 1%. By 2060, 68.9 or 69%, so a 10% drop of European Americans, 30.6% of Hispanics, so we're going up, almost doubling our Hispanic population, slightly increasing our African American population to 14.7, and then the Asian Pacific Islanders, also a slight increase from about 5 to about 8.5. So pretty much almost like a pretty good jump there, though. And then American Indian from 1 to 1.5, hardly any. If you look at their NAEP reading scores in 2011 by race and ethnicity, though, this is where it becomes shocking, because white children, and remember, SES is probably our most common denominator of what causes problems, so we have poor white children as well. 44% of our children that were considered to be white scored at or above proficiency in grade 4. African Americans, only 17% of the African American population scored at or above. And Latino was only 18%. Asian Pacific Islanders, 50% of them scored at or above in grade 4. And then American Indians, only 18%. So if you were African American, Latino, and or American Indian, only 18% of you scored at or above proficiency, which means 80%, about 80%, or a little over 80% of you were below grade level or did not score at proficient level. White children at grade 8 was 43%, African American 15%, so there was a slight drop in both of those. Latino 19, a little bit raise. Asian Pacific Islander, slight drop again, 49. American Indian actually went up from 18 to 22. So we have to look at something called the stereotype threat, and that really is a phenomenon in which individuals are aware of the stereotype, like I'm just a dumb Polak would be, because it used to be that when a long time ago, like not a long time ago, but in the 1950s, 40s and 50s, if you were Eastern European, you were thought of to be not very bright, so they scored less on those tests. So individuals who are aware of a stereotype about a group of which they belong become anxious about confirming that stereotype, and their anxiety causes them to perform below their ability levels. So we have to kind of work against those stereotypes and break those stereotypes. So stereotype threat is of greatest concern when the members of a certain group feel that they are not expected to do well on a particular school task. So we just kind of have to talk about stereotypes and break down stereotypes. A lot of this came about during the effects of school desegregation. Many of you know about the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, which brought an end to racially segregated schools. It was interesting, though. If you have a chance, go on YouTube and look for a video called "A Girl Like Me," and it was interesting because the African American kids in the video were showed white dolls and black dolls, and they actually when they say which is a good doll, they would point to the white doll, and they'd say which one was a bad doll, and they would point to the black doll. So that's one of the things that they talk about, is this idea of stereotyping. If we look back and talk about that stereotype threat, because one of the things that if little children, we're talking like these kids were like 4 years old, 3 and 4 years old, start to see themselves as good and bad based on their skin color, then it's hard for teachers to undo that. And it undermines the educational system. So one of the things that was one of the main reasons for this desegregation. However, what ended up happening during that time was we didn't actually just go, yay, yay, let's all integrate. What ended up happening was they kind of created two separate school systems, in the sense that they rezoned all the schools so that all the people that lived in this area went to this school, so that all the black people lived in one area, so they went to the school and it remained predominantly black. And then they would rezone a district so that it would remain predominantly white. Some people even talked about that with special education, because about the same time the special ed came about, and it was just another way to segregate, because there was way more children of color that were placed in programs for like emotional disturbance and learning disabilities and mental retardation than was statistically possible to be able to do that. So it was just another way to segregate kids along racial lines. During the 1970s, though, the Supreme Court decided to force local school districts to desegregate, which meant they called it forced busing. And so what they did was they actually would bus African American kids or children of color to predominantly white schools, and bus predominantly white children to schools that were predominantly black. And so they forced local school districts to desegregate by any means that they were possible. So forced segregation ended up happening, and the overall effect was good for those underrepresented kids. It had a small, but it was a positive effect, and it was statistically significant. So what do we do about this? We've become much more culturally diverse. We're still got a long way to go, and with today's climate, people are still, arguing about the merits of this, and we have an uprise in the populist idea of that segregation is not a bad thing. But in our schools, and if you're going to be a teacher, you have to talk about teaching all children. So we have to have fairness and balance with schools, which means that we have to provide for all children. Even if our school is predominantly African American, they have to have the same resources as the other ones. And matter of fact, they might even need more, because we're trying to close that opportunity gap that goes along with it. But we also have to look at our educational material and make sure they reflect the diversity of the student population. When I was teaching, I was teaching about World War II, and there was no mention of any African Americans and what they did during World War II. It was like they didn't exist. I had my students go, because they were predominantly African American, go in and interview their grandparents and parents about World War II and what their roles were, and some of them were even great-grandparents. And that's when I first found out about the Tuskegee Airmen and what the Tuskegee Airmen had done. And they were like one of the most successful bomber. They actually rode along with the bombers, protection squads. And then it just makes me think about it today. I just saw the movie Hidden Figures, and it kind of made me upset to know that there was these, amazing African American women who actually helped put a man on the moon. But I don't think you probably ever read that in any of your history books. So it takes Hollywood to do a movie on it for us to figure this stuff out, and that shouldn't be happening. The materials in our schools should reflect all of the students' populations and what everyone's contributions were. And that means that the supplementary material, I can't say that, is authentic, which means it represents the kind of kids that we're working with, but it also gives people multiple perspectives. And that can create that homeschool connection. When I found out about that grandfather being a Tuskegee Airman, we had him come in and talk to the students about it, about what it was and all that kind of, what he did. And that was before all the movies and stuff. We also took apart our history book, and we wrote in their stories of their grandparents and what the role of the African American was in the World War II. And we bound the book back up and sent it to the publisher. And we also have to avoid stereotypes. You don't want to say things like, well, where they come, or what kind of parent he has, because that's just passing on the sins of a community or the sins of the parent onto the child. Let that child be their own person and not have to do that. Zero tolerance for slurs, taunts, and jokes. I tried really hard to do this, but I also had to talk to some of my kids in their own community about this. I had, as I said, I worked in a predominantly African American schools, and the kids themselves would call each other the N-word, and I would say, you can't say that. And they go, yeah, it's okay, Miss P, I'm only joking. We're just joking with each other. We're no mean nothing. It's no big deal. I go, no, because I can't. If I said that to you, I would get in so much trouble. And they're like, no, it's okay. You're cool. You could say it. We know you love us. I'd say, no, but if somebody walked by and they heard me calling you that, I would be fired. And then I said, well, what about Freddie? Freddie, he was a white kid in the class. Could Freddie call you that? And they go, oh, no, we kill him. Well, you can't kill one, you can't be angry at one child for using that word, but yet you use it freely. And so one of the things that you have to realize is the difference between those taunts and those jokes, and when you're kidding, when you're not kidding, and stuff like that, because you just can't have, there's zero tolerance for it, whether it be somebody who's transgender or sexual identity, or whether it be someone's racial makeup, or whether it be male or female. You just can't do it. And that's creating that tolerance and respect for others, that it's a respect zone, and it's a judgment-free zone, schools. And assignments, you got to watch what kind of assignments you give. Make sure that they're not offensive or frustrating to the student. And then we also have to do cooperative learning, structured cooperative learning, because one of the things that we found with culture is that children that come from the lower socioeconomic status and some of the cultures of color tend to be much more focused on cooperation, and children from middle class and upper class families tend to be more competitive and individualistic. You'll hear teachers that will talk and they'll say, well, she collaborated on this. This wasn't her work. This was somebody else's work. They were cheating. Well, in most jobs you collaborate on stuff. So are you really cheating, or are you just working smarter? And they found that most families that come from poorer families or lower socioeconomic status, that they have to rely on families and friends a lot more. So they're much more cooperative in their spirit. That goes along with that. So using cooperative learning tends to be a good way of helping with that community sense of community. One of the things that I've learned, that when you look at this too, when you look at Kagan structures, which is a cooperative learning structure or program, Kagan says, if you're only calling on kids, you only know whether one or two of the kids in the class really know the answer. It's the kids that continue to raise their hand and always call on. But when you use a Kagan structure, which is a cooperative structure where they have to talk to one another and they have to share their ideas first, then every kid in the class is involved. So you have 100% participation versus 98 or 97% participation. Lack of participation.